What is the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear Kingdom Come Deliverance? If I had to guess, it will be a somewhat fun sandbox experience where you can get away with a lot of mischief, a title that doesn't try to lecture about your barbaric behavior under the guise of player choice, or maybe you just really enjoy the dynamics between Radzik, Hanush and Capon. Naturally, these are the things I cared about the most in the first game, and I hoped Warhorse Studios would just use that formula for the sequel and adjust a few features I wasn't particularly fond of in Kingdom Come 1, but sadly that didn't happen. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is in many ways a downgrade from the first installment. A disappointing sequel that felt more like a B-rated 90s action comedy, heavily doused in contemporary safe space humor and strong female energy. And I know that I'm coming in with the negatives right from the get-go, but you also have to understand that this game was one of my most anticipated titles this year that isn't exactly my wheelhouse. I'm an FPS guy, I enjoy survival, racing games, a little bit of action hack and slash. RPGs, especially slow-paced ones like Kingdom Come, are not what I usually go for to unwind. That being the case, not long after the second game from the franchise was announced, I decided to give Kingdom Come Deliverance a go, mainly because I was pleasantly surprised by the director's tweets and how he's unwilling to bend the knee in favor of historical accuracy, that is until a month ago, and I have to say the first game really succeeded in representing the Czech population in their own element. It felt like a game made by people who are proud of their origins and their cultural heritage. That isn't to say Kingdom Come 1 didn't have problems, in fact it had plenty of issues, but they pale in comparison with the absolute landfill in the sequel. First, however, I want to talk about the things I liked in Kingdom Come 2 because I believe it will be easier to just get those very few positives out of the way before we move on to the interesting part. You know, the drama and me shitting on the game, which is without a doubt the reason why many of you are watching reviews of it in the first place. Anyway. The biggest redeeming quality of this game is something many of you will probably not see coming, but it is in fact one of the things I greatly appreciate when it comes to games, and that is no anti-piracy scripts have been implemented into the code, which means that much like Kingdom Come 1, the second installment is very mod friendly. You even have access to the developer's console, and I'm just gonna say that not many game makers let you toy around with console commands in this day and age, so big thumbs up for letting people have fun with that. I would also like to mention that the game will be coming to GOG this spring, and even though I don't recommend buying it, if you're dead set on giving your money to play an inferior sequel, at least purchase it on good old games so that you can download all the files and actually own it, as opposed to on Steam where you only possess the license to play the titles in your library. Now, as many of you probably know, Kingdom Come 1 was made on the CryEngine, and I was a bit worried at first they were gonna use Unreal 5 for the second game. Fortunately, Warhorse didn't do that, and I'm glad they stuck with the CryEngine, even though every big title nowadays uses the latest version of Unreal. And I don't know about you, but I've started to feel that UE5 fatigue, where every game looks and feels the same. It almost reminds me of that period in gaming between 2005 and 2012, when a lot of titles, mainly free-to-play mods, were using the source engine. Many of those games would even have the same props found in Half-Life 2 in them. Not even reskin models, the same couches, barrels, palettes, textures, even characters, which sadly earned this engine the status of a shovelware game making tool. The same thing happened to Unity almost a decade later because a lot of people were learning how to develop games on it, as a result of which the Steam store got littered with hundreds, if not thousands of janky, borderline broken dumpster horror titles that seem to have been made by 10-year-olds for their school projects. So yeah, I'm happy to see that other software frameworks are still being utilized despite the current overwhelming dominance of Unreal in the gaming industry. I also have to give credit where credit is due and say that I had absolutely zero problems regarding the performance of Kingdom Come 2 on my PC. I played the first game on the same machine with the same configs on Ultra, and I noticed how badly optimized the original was, especially when you enter a city or a place with more than 5 NPCs on your screen at a time, like the markets for instance. The frame rate would often plummet below 60 FPS, and it was really jarring considering that while on the road, you're anywhere between 110 and 140. In the second game, however, I don't think I ever experienced sub 70 FPS. The game ran incredibly smooth, so I can't really complain about performance, even more so that we're talking about a new release, and as you may or may not know, bad optimization is pretty common in the current dark ages of gaming, so yeah, definitely happy with what the developers have done on that front. When it comes to music, visuals and landscapes, I think they were pretty alright. I did enjoy how even though the game is very recent, it still looks like something you're supposed to play, which isn't to say that it looks bad, but you could tell that hyperrealism wasn't the main focus of the developers. Jankiness and glitches were frequently seen much like in the first game, though I couldn't really find any game-breaking bugs, and that's always a positive sign in my book. One of the most surprising aspects of the game was the way that he designed the women. Most of them were either average looking to quite pretty, I must say. I failed to see super fat models or Last of Us Abbeys. Each and every female character model was feminine, curvy and generally nice on the eye. One of the secondary characters even got me thirsty for some milk, so yeah, can't complain about ugliness in this game in the slightest. Well, Kubianka and scenic were up there on the unattractive scale for sure, but I think their occupation and lifestyles match perfectly their looks. Besides, that's one way to make memorable characters, just throwing a couple of thugs with some protagonist tier handsomeness and you automatically make them 50% easier to spot. I have to say I probably had a bit more fun with the ragdolls than I should have. After all, Gmail taught me playing with the unresponsive corpses of Alex and Kleiner could be enjoyable in moderation. Now there's Wolf and Wild Dogs encounters, which were missing in the first game, with the exception of that one mission in the Teresa DLC where you had to help Henry's previous girlfriend find some herbs, and to be honest, if I turn a blind eye to the combat, I really enjoyed the bleeding mechanic where a wounded NPC would eventually die from blood loss. That was the case with wolves and dogs running away from you after sustaining major lacerations, and I actually regret not recording a part of the game where I was chasing after a wounded wolf halfway through the map only to see it flop 30 feet in front of me out of exhaustion. It was a truly magnificent hunt and by far one of the most exciting moments in the game. Other cool bits were Henry's nightmare about the people he'd slain coming back from the dead to haunt him, and the semi massacre we took part in, murdering everyone in our path, while watching a soldier dunk a woman's head in one of those water receptacles people use to wash themselves, another guy slitting the throat of a person from behind, everyone screaming in horror. Honestly, that scene was awesome and it really managed to conjure up my inner human for a hot second. The stealth mechanics were pretty alright, even though the NPCs were almost 100% blind. Even so, I like sneaking up on people and performing successful silent takedowns, emphasis on successful. Pickpocketing was also pretty cool. Overall, the stuff they ported over from the previous game with a few exceptions I'm gonna touch upon later was rather entertaining. There's a wide variety of clothes and armor pieces which you can match to eventually obtain a full set. You have plenty of choice when it comes to close range weapons, bows, crossbows, and even some proto firearms which were so inaccurate I only used them twice during my whole playthrough. The points and perks system was pretty competent. I would go as far as to say it was even more intuitive than in the first game, because as far as I can remember, in Kingdom Come 1, in order to unlock abilities, you had to use both your mouse and the E button. In the second game, however, you can just double click on your preferred skill to activate it. In general, I consider the quality of life improvements a welcome change, like for example, now your horse has an autopilot and cruise control. You can just press and hold E, kick up your feet and enjoy some ice cream while advancing to your quest marker. That is, at least until Red gets startled by wolves or bandits and you end up on your back facing the sky. Another pretty useful feature was the preset system. Now you have 3 slots for outfits that you can switch between depending on the situation, as opposed to the first game where you had to do all of that manually every time you wanted to LARP as a bandit or a nobleman. Torturing captives was another cool segment in Kingdom Come 2, and you could actually overdo it and kill them if you're not careful enough, which alas isn't my strongest suit. The HUD was pretty much the same as the first game. You had your compass on the top and your health and stamina bars at the bottom of the screen, plus your horse stamina, or alternatively the enemy's health bar if you're fighting someone. It's pretty tight and comprehensible, so yeah, nothing to complain about when it comes to the UI. And unfortunately that's pretty much it regarding the pros. I could possibly talk a bit longer about bits and pieces that rub me the right way, but I find going into autistic detail when explaining stuff isn't always very entertaining. Besides, telling you every single detail in the game could make this video more than 45 minutes long, which isn't exactly my goal here. With that being said, let's talk about the negatives, and believe me, there's a lot to cover, mainly because they're an amalgamation of problems I found in the previous game, which also served as a heavy framework for the sequel, plus a lot of newly introduced issues, some of which you're probably aware of, and others about to discover in a second. The combat was absolutely appalling. It was basically a rerun of the first game's fighting system with a few minor changes, but overall it was the same clunky, disgusting mess with unresponsive directional inputs and one of the most annoying camera shakes I'd ever experienced. The kick activated exactly once in my 80 hours playthrough, and at some point I decided I should just stick to stealth because I was getting pretty mad. And it's not like I couldn't learn the combinations, perfect blocks and clinches. I just didn't want to. I hated every single second of the combat, but I think the worst part of it was undeniably the enemy lock-on, which is fine if you're facing off against a single opponent, but the majority of encounters were you against a bunch of bandits or humans and your target changes based on the proximity of the enemy. So at one point you're zeroed in on a guy you've almost done in, and all of a sudden someone else steps up and your crosshair snaps onto him, leaving you open for lunge attacks you cannot parry. All because of the fucking controller bullshit everyone loves so much. I swear, the combat mechanics in this game felt like someone from Warhorse Studios slapped a copy of Chivalry on the round table and said, "Listen fellas, we need to make the opposite of this fun and engaging combat." I mean, the fact that I dislike stealth and I still picked it over the honorable way of fighting enemies says a lot. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 was a very long and also very boring sequel. If I had to think of anything a game shouldn't be, that is uninteresting. By the end of our first encounter with Margrave Jobst, I was already fed up with it to the point I just wanted to uninstall and watch the rest on YouTube, but as a reviewer with integrity, I think playing a game all the way through is the least I could do for you, since many other alleged game reviewers and journalists only skim over playthroughs and lie about finishing the titles they cover. But that's besides the point. I think the second installment of Kingdom Come Deliverance was even longer than the first game. There was a multitude of stealth missions, a lot more than a medieval game should have in my opinion, as well as some occasional sieges where we were either the assailant or the protector. But I think what really made the game so obtuse was the fact that there was way too many twists and turns in the story, people betraying us, then siding with us to the point I didn't know if I was fighting for the good guys or the enemy. Not to mention the inclusion of a bunch of characters I couldn't care less about, who replaced the ones I grew fond of by the end of Kingdom Come 1. Robert wasn't there, Sir Divish was not present either, and House of Lipa as well as our actual father Radzik were only shown in 2 or 3 brief cutscenes just to remind us of their existence. On top of that, the side quest felt more like a waste of time, involving a lot of fast traveling from one place to another, asking people around for directions, or alternatively the person you're looking for. In the spirit of other RPGs, there was fetch quests as well, bring me this, transport that, etc. And when you take into account that some of those side missions can branch off and further extend the task you've been given, you can already see how sticking to the main storyline is something I would much rather do than carry sacks of flour or sniff the ground like a hound to dig up the remains of someone who fell into a septic pit like the idiot he is. Another aspect of the game I found incredibly annoying was the fact that you can't switch between presets in combat nor equip armor. The only thing you can do is choose a weapon and that's it. Can't even count the number of times I would pose as a bourgeois, dressed in nice clothes, which aren't even able to protect you from mosquito bites, and in the next moment I'm facing a group of fully kitted men that you can't reason with nor intimidate. They kill you, you try your luck once more, then they murder you again, you load on a real save which could be as far back as 2 hours ago because you're trying not to use up all of your schnapps, and it is so bad. I mean, I can understand that all of this has been implemented for the sake of realism, but when realism comes at the cost of fun, this is where I draw the line. The same thing goes for potions and bandages. You can't patch yourself up while in battle, you can't even down a quick marigold concoction to bump your health up a bit. It's ridiculous, and those types of mechanics absolutely deserve being mentioned among the other issues I had with this game. After going to bed with someone, the slot you used during the conversation gets reset to default, and you have to put everything back on after getting up. That was also something I could have done without. Subversion of expectations in the storyline was done awfully. Just imagine working your ass off in the first game, literally going from zero to hero, acquiring wealth and servants, only to end up in the dirt again in the sequel. You're being put on display for your transgressions, everyone's mocking you, everyone's being very rude and demeaning. What's the point of becoming a nobleman in Kingdom Come 1 if the sequel makes you start from square one again? I don't get it, and it's not like I was asking for much. Just let me have decent armor and 1000 groschen in my pocket to buy a new weapon and potions, and that's it. The first, I would say, 3 to 4 hours of the game were absolutely redundant. In fact, they were plain stupid if you ask me. What they could have done instead is let us fight the bandits and then escape by the skin of our teeth, losing the letter and our retinue in the process. Even being captured by the bandits with the option to retrieve most of our stuff and fleeing their base unnoticed would have been better than making me play as literal scum for a good portion of the game. Not to mention that by doing so, the game would have been much shorter and action-packed, something this sequel desperately needed. Honestly, I think the writers did an awful job when it comes to that part of Kingdom Come 2's narrative, and it's obvious that they have zero idea what makes us tick. The hunger system is completely unnecessary, since foods only restore a tiny bit of health and energy. If there were food buffs, I can see why those items could prove useful, but when other much more potent health restoration items and methods are available, the hunger meter feels like something totally unnecessary as opposed to a cool mechanic that adds more complexity. Not to mention that there's a perk that can literally restore your health from nearly dead to full, provided you wash each of your attires. It's as easy as pressing D button 3 times. The crossbows were basically treated as snipers, and they decided to implement wobbly vision, the same fatigue mechanic you see in Call of Duty games where you have to hold your breath to stabilize your aim. And the shitty part is you're expecting to have an easier time shooting with a crossbow as opposed to with a bow, since you're not pulling on a heavy string, but they still fucked it up so that you could use the steady aim and eagle eye perks. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of you keyboard experts will tell me how medieval crossbows are very heavy, but if someone like me who can hold an 8 kg plank with both hands, mind you, can pull it off, I have no doubt that a medieval soldier doing this all day long would have had zero issues with shooting straight for a few seconds. No, I'm not buying it. The crossbows were stupid and far less enjoyable to use than I had anticipated. Much like the weapons and armor, the potion making was heavily dependent on the RPG mechanics, and even when you execute every step perfectly, if you don't have high enough level of herbalism, you're bound to screw up every single concoction you make. Armor and weapons prices were heavily increased, traders in the second installment had a lot less money than those in Kingdom Come 1, which made selling gear you acquired during missions significantly harder, and I have the feeling that they've done all that in order for you to explore more places and waste your time so that Warhorse can boast about the artificially inflated playtime of people who bought the game. Obtaining coins was much harder in the sequel too, and when you pair that with the low wealth of merchants in the cities combined with the incredibly high prices of gear, you're left with no other choice but to steal stuff. So far so good. But there's one small problem. Just to put things in perspective, when I played the first game I got more than 15k groschen by simply raiding a tavern every night. I grinded for a couple of hours without being caught by the guards a single time, and I managed to get my hands on enough money to buy the best armor available in the city I was frequenting. In Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, however, that's borderline impossible since the NPCs are a lot more perceptive and the guards are literally everywhere. Even opening chests with a nearly completed thief skill set lures the inhabitants of the house you've broken in, and you have two options: fight the whole village or flee. That's how bad the anti-crime system was. At one point it almost felt as if they had modern surveillance systems everywhere. Cameras, motion detectors, and I was just there, swimming against the current with a lockpick and a few black rags on my body. I even did the experiment to kill a single shepherd in an area completely devoid of other humans. I beat the crap out of him and the game still handed me over the wanted badge, even though there was literally no one in the perimeter. Like, did the dog press the panic button in the man's thatched hut, or did one of the sheep call 911? Tell me how on earth did they find out about my crimes in a situation like that? Seriously, it's awful, absolutely awful, and I feel sorry for anyone who enjoys this game more than the first one. Not to mention that people had on average like 8 groschen on them, even the treasure chest would give you like 50-60 groschen, and the rest is items you have to sell and haggle over to maybe get 300 coins in total, which is nowhere near enough to buy a good weapon or even a single decent armor piece. Mending broken items also costs an arm and a leg, and drops from defeated enemies are more often than not in horrible condition to incentivize to craft to repair stuff. Listen. When I play an RPG, the last thing I want in it is survival mechanics. All I want is nice drops and ways to make a shit ton of money for good armor and a nice sword. I don't care about crafting potions, repairing armor, collecting materials. Like, what am I to expect from a potential third game? Cutting down wood to start a fire and build a log cabin? This is ridiculous. Honestly, who came up with all that survival bullshit in the sequel? I was okay with potion crafting in the original because this was the only thing you made yourself and you could easily bypass it by stealing a lot of money and buying a full bag of concoctions. What Kingdom Come 2 did was absolutely ruin the thief class and completely obliterate every single vestige of fun by turning the game into a crafting simulator. And to top it all off, now there's one more step added to silent kills and takedowns called Perfect Block, which is incredibly stupid, especially earlier on in the game when you're lacking in skills. Basically there's a chance of having your sneak attack deflected while performing either of the aforementioned actions, which activates a quick time event that you have to execute perfectly so that you don't enter combat mode. I'm pretty confident that in the first game your silent kill could still be cancelled by a very strong enemy, but at least you didn't have to time a counter attack that doesn't even secure you the kill since the success rate in both games is based on a dice roll. That said, I did enjoy shanking people from the back in the first game a lot more since it was plain and simple without any additional actions and artificial difficulty. Furthermore, you could increase your level pretty easily by chalking out NPCs that are asleep and try your luck with guards later when you feel confident in your perks and strength level. Good luck pulling that off on the non-playable characters in Kingdom Come 2, each and every one of whom sleep with one eye open. You literally have to turn God mode on to not alert them. But anyway. Moving on to something I absolutely hated, on a few occasions I was forced to play as that old tramp from the first game, the priest who was surprisingly good with the sword, and yeah, while I can't deny that I did play as Teresa in the first game, you also have to take into account the fact that her story is completely optional since we're talking about a DLC, while Godwin's quests were part of the main storyline in the sequel, so you couldn't just skip them. Not to mention that they were mind-numbingly boring, whereas Teresa's story that took place after the raid of Skalitz was actually pretty interesting. If my memory serves me right, when I played as her I saw the mines for the first time during my playthrough, as well as some of the coolest shots in the game depicting a burning village during nighttime, observed from the neighboring hill while taking care of my wounded brother. It really was a rather welcome change that actually served the storyline of the game perfectly by giving us another perspective on what went down in Skalitz after Henry left the settlement to call for help. But even if we shake hands on the fact that Teresa was portrayed as Henry's savior in the first game, we also have to consider the way she saved him. While Katherine killed soldiers with nothing but a dagger and the brute force of her knockers, Teresa on the other hand offered herself to the bandits who attacked Henry and served as a distraction long enough for Sir Robert to intervene. Also, her main weapon was a bow and she couldn't equip armor, which even further sold me the idea that I'm playing as a medieval woman who's not trained in close quarter combat. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 struck me as one of those games that tries to steer you towards the right path, but it would often come across as a lecture on your bad decisions. Since this game is more or less a story about actual events that took place in medieval Europe, the player choice is reduced to only being able to kill non-essential NPCs and losing or gaining reputation, whether that be among your group of allies, citizens, or overall regions on the map. At the end of the game, your deceased parents will spawn out of thin air and begin judging your life choices after they passed away, and even though I didn't go overboard with murdering innocent people, I still got the bad ending, which means that in order to get their approval, I literally had to turn into a living saint by solving every single argument peacefully, disobeying the orders of people like the Dry Devil, who is nowhere near as much of a pussy as Henry and Capon are, and avoid disappointing my close circle of friends. But wasn't Henry's adoptive father Martin, who told him to fight until the bitter end, granted he'd chosen the path of adventure? Obviously, given the predicament I was in when he said that, his advice could have been interpreted as gather all your strength to live another day, but it can also mean that I have to defeat my enemies to protect the country I love and the friends I cherish. And big surprise, during times of war, that often means taking the lives of other people. Not to mention that Martin used to be a soldier too, and I bet he had lopped off more than a head or two for his king, so what is a shed full of corpses to him? If I had to play by the book, abstain from stealing and solve everything peacefully, this game would have probably taken me 300 hours to complete. I'm sorry, but I'm not that much of a masochist. It was clear that this excuse for an RPG wanted to render you obedient and non-violent by instilling guilt in you, but when all the guards you've taken down wake up after an autosave and start chasing you, you realize that your only option is to just roll back and put them down for good. When the main quests give you pocket change and weapons cost as much as a decent second-hand car, you cannot avoid stealing. Honestly, whoever thought that people would derive any form of enjoyment from a pacifist run in this game clearly hasn't played it after it was finished. And to be fair, I wouldn't be surprised if the QA at Warhorse only made sure the game runs well on all platforms and just decided to call it quits after that. The dialogue was a mixed bag, from almost incomprehensible drunk muttering and heavy slang to Starbucks employee level of cringe. The consistency in writing was not great to say the least. It felt like they dumbed down the main quest speech complexity to the point that even a first grader could get the gist of the storyline, whereas the dialogue pertaining to less important events was more or less on the same level as the small talk in the first game. As I said, there was a lot of strong independent woman energy, even though realistically speaking, if men were to suddenly disappear during those times, it would have more likely than not been much more peaceful, but it won't have taken a month before everything and everyone reverted back to the Stone Age. Just help Rosa finish her book, then read it, or observe one of the wench's behavior in the bathhouse and you'll see what I'm talking about. Mommy Milkers was also portrayed as someone stronger than several men, and at some point after the siege of Nebakov she saved us by missing through several guards. Jan Žižka himself told us how she's more valuable than a few soldiers, which even further reinforces the anime trope in this game, where the prettiest characters are also the strongest ones. And that's completely fine in fiction, but absolutely ridiculous in the context of medieval realism titles such as Kingdom Come Deliverance. You tell me how there isn't propaganda in this game and how based it is. I can understand if it were fiction, where everyone had magic spells and overpowered abilities, but taking down fully armored soldiers with a measly dagger, considering you're a squishy woman with nothing but a dress to cover your tits, was borderline ridiculous if not laughable. So for anyone who thinks the first game had some signs of wokeness, which definitely was the case, wait until you play the sequel. The hyper-feminist tropes alone in Kingdom Come 2 are enough to make you roll your eyes back from second-hand embarrassment, unless you're one of those people who thinks this title is a masterpiece, which is objectively false. Not only is it not a masterpiece, it is much worse than its predecessor that was already a 6 out of 10 game. Speaking of propagating certain types of narratives, feminism wasn't the only thing that made the game woke. At one point, maybe somewhere in the second half of the game, I met our boy Samuel, who is Jewish, living in a Jewish district in Gutenberg. Of course, he didn't waste time to tell us how oppressed his people were and how the citizens mistreated them because of their faith, while also insulting us with Jewish slurs to show his superiority as a member of the tribe chosen by God himself. Truly ironic if you ask me, but anyway. Throughout the campaign, almost every interaction with Sam was him reminding us how he's not like us and people are only regarding his kind as nothing more but walking coin sacks. I did however try to get on his good side since Daniel Vavra himself, his Jewish ancestry, and I thought maybe I was gonna receive some brownie points for helping the Jews, even though Samuel himself gave me a dull quest in the very beginning and betrayed us for he was afraid I was maybe some kind of a spy or part of the anti-Semitic gang in Gutenberg. It took him a while to warm up to me, but what was really funny, and I briefly thought of adding this to the pro section in my review, which I didn't do for obvious reasons, if you tell him your sword has been given to you by Martin, he keeps it for himself, but if you say Radzik bestowed it to you, he would immediately give it back. I thought that was a very cool attention to detail moment right there, even more so that Samuel's decision to either keep the weapon or hand it over is directly connected to his link with your adoptive father Martin, the blacksmith. Right after Sigismund himself ordered Otto von Berghoff to send his people to Gutenberg and wipe out the tribe we sided with, we had to take up arms and help the Jews leave the city, and the mission felt very forced, almost as if the overlords themselves were trying to remind us what happened more than 8 years ago should never happen again. Maybe that's why those same people decided to create a country for themselves shortly after World War II, since they saw how vulnerable they were before they were united under one flag, but I digress. What I'm trying to say is that there's definitely a reason why the small hats were included in the game, and guilt tripping was again employed by them to hopefully retain the status of an oppressed minority. There was also other examples of diversity and inclusion shoved down our throats, like the Nomads camp or the Gypsies, and again, skipping this part of the game was pretty much impossible. In Warhorse Studios' defense though, Gypsies were indeed present in Bohemia even back then, but the fact that they weren't included in the first game says more than words can convey. say. Clearly, the devs' priorities regarding the sequel were making a title that looked and felt more like Cappadocia in Istanbul than a story that takes place in the heart of Europe, which is really unfortunate, especially for people who are keen on getting immersed in the authenticity of certain regions. The tip of the ice cream, however, was obviously our friend Musa, a physician from Mali who decided to travel more than 7,000 kilometers north in hopes to steal some blue-eyed brides and complete his harem. Coincidentally, just before I interacted with him, two soldiers met each other in front of his tent, and they had a little chat about him that concluded with how Musa would be a much better fit to run their base than their current commander. Clearly, that doesn't allude to anything that's been pushed by the woke narrative in this day and age. It was just an innocent conversation without any sinister meaning, like the prospect of Muslims ruling over Christians. I wonder how that ended up for a country like Lebanon. Jokes aside, his backstory was explained pretty well, so that we're not in the dark about the reason why he chose to leave his country, but considering how far away Bohemia is from his birthplace, it seems highly unlikely for someone like him to head straight for war-torn Europe of all places. Mind you, at that time Bohemia was being attacked by Hungarians and Cumans, not to mention that Hungary itself was the buffer zone between the Christian world and a newly established Muslim country on the Balkan Peninsula in Anatolia called the Ottoman Empire. Now, for those of you who know nothing about European history, I just wanna say that the Ottomans were one of the most feared groups of people back in medieval times, since they managed to conquer the vast majority of Byzantium and the Balkans in the span of just 100 years. By 1402, the Turkish Empire was already as big, if not bigger than France and Spain, and their conquests were brutal and highly successful. Everywhere they went, they would leave behind devastation. Men chopped up bodies, they would women, and often load them up on wagons as sex slaves. The children of those poor souls were often taken away by force and trained to become the Sultan's most loyal soldiers called Janissaries. Forced religious conversions were a common practice in places with predominant Christian population to prevent revolts, since Muslims must remain loyal to God and by extension to his proxy on earth, the Sultan. Now tell me how likely is it for Musa, which is the Mohammedan name for Moses by the way, to be accepted among the Czech people, even more so that he's not even Caucasian, unlike the Turks. Certainly this game was made by idiots, for idiots, and there is no doubt in my mind that despite his deflections on Twitter, Daniel Vavra is indeed a big old sellout who betrayed his fanbase and turned 180 degrees the moment he saw the pre-orders for his game surpass the target assigned to him by the marketing teams of PlayOn and Embracer Group, both of which are pushing diversity, equity and inclusion in video games, closely following the orders of their bosses from BlackRock. And if you don't believe what I said, try and Google PlayOn's acquisition of Warhorse. It happened exactly 1 year after Kingdom Come 1 was released. Strange, isn't it? It's almost like that guy who got banned on Steam for speaking the truth has a point. I think that's pretty much it for... Hold on a second. I believe I might have missed something. That's right, Henry and Capon are now homosexuals. That's one way to ruin established characters, I suppose, especially Capon, who's been pretty vocal about his passion for bonking wenches, not only in the first game, but in the sequel too, up until 2 hours prior to the end of the main story that is, when you go up to him to say goodbye and you're offered 3 choices. The first one is... kiss Capon. Now, as much as I wanted to show what happens after choosing this option, I couldn't bring myself to do it because I felt I might end up seeing my breakfast again but in a much slimier form, so I'll let you Google the scene by yourself. Hopefully you'll be able to handle this better than me. Of course, that wasn't the only instance of homosexuality displayed on our screens. Istvan, Toth and Eric also had a little moment during the mission where we had to escape the Trotsky castle, and I know they're pretty much confirmed a couple in Kingdom Come 1, but the main difference in the first game was that their intimacy was looked down upon and even spoken about in a rather mocking tone, which would be the appropriate reaction of straight people during that historical period. I think we should take notes from our ancestors more often if you ask me. After all, we get what we tolerate, don't we? Of course, the wokest moments were conveniently pushed towards the last quarter of the story so that people play more than 2 hours and lose their right to refund the game. Sadly, all the controlled opposition, the safe space channels and the sellouts are putting this game on a pedestal, and the little teamies watching those channels soak in the hype because they can't think for themselves, which ultimately led to this game selling 2 million copies in just 2 weeks. Shields like Worth a Buy, who was supposedly one of us, also pivoted in the other direction and even went as far as showing an article about the remains of an African person found in the Czech Republic. But the truth is, if you live in Great Britain, there's almost a 100% chance that the scientific essays you're reading are heavily doused in far-left propaganda and false information, so the fact that he dug up that article proves exactly nothing. And even if they had found something, it would most likely be a trophy inside a merchant's inventory and not an actual African who lived among white Europeans in peace. As this person on Quora said, a black guy or a woman in 15th century Bohemia would more likely than not be dealt with in a very brutal way, so no matter how much you're trying to portray gay stuff and racial diversity as something acceptable back then, you're just lying to yourself and others in order to keep your channel whitelisted. That's a simple truth, you're a sellout and a corporate shill, and people with integrity should never take your opinion on games seriously ever again. Even more so that you used to be a let's player pretending to be scared by shovelware monsters. I hope you understand that you're an actual disgrace of a reviewer, Mac, and you'll always remain one. And the last but definitely not least in terms of importance walk theme was something many will probably give me a lot of shit for mentioning, was the constant mental health reminders in the form of Henry's PTSD and Capon's traumatic experience with tight spaces, which was ironic because Hans didn't mind being squeezed between his bed frame and Henry's crotch in the slightest. In fact, Warhorse was driving the point home so hard in the sequel, it felt like the Scarlet's flashbacks appeared between every major cutscene. I'm also pretty confident that in the first game Henry experienced many fewer episodes compared to the second one, and they were also presented as nightmarish memories as opposed to blockbuster scenes constantly telling you how it become like those you want to take revenge on. And again, the reason why I chose to include the mental disorders in the walk section is because many of the far left parasites would lump together depression, anxiety and post-traumatic disorder with actual debilitating mental deficiencies as schizophrenia, you know, conditions that are exponentially more serious than the Zoomer syndromes, because some people dislike working and they would rather take advantage of social benefits instead of doing what their grandparents and great-grandparents did, you know, living their lives as productive members of society while also fighting their own demons without bothering anyone with their tantrums and special needs. But apparently that's what always happens in wealthy countries. The easier and safer life gets, the softer everyone becomes. So yeah, I think that's all I want to say about this game. Do not buy it, do not even pirate it. The faster this game dies, the better for everyone who's sick of modern gaming. Like, share and subscribe if you enjoyed what you just watched. In fact, I'm gonna say something nobody does at the end of their videos. Why not save this review to one of your libraries like favorites, or maybe add it to one of your custom collections? That might be a first since that doesn't help the algorithm in any way, shape or form. Anyway, enough rambling, stay awesome and we'll see each other sooner than ever. I'm out.
Oh, that treacherous little whore. That snake. That fucking turncoat!